All right, it is just after 3 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon to talk a little bit about the K through 12 Guidelines for Excellence in Environmental Education. This is something that I think is a really important tool for our field, and the more people who know about it, the more we can share best practices and utilize it. So I'm excited you're here to learn a little bit more about it. If you haven't met me before, my name's Katie Navin, and I am the director of the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education. And we are a network of about 850 or so environmental educators across the state who are working to advance environmental literacy and teaching about the environment in all kinds of settings, whether that be in zoos, nature centers, museums, community organizations, nonprofits, government agencies, and classrooms. So you can find us all over the state, and our three goals are really to drive excellence in the field, to mobilize support for the field, and to foster collaboration. So if there's any way that we can help you do any of those things, please look us up, and we would love to support you in your work. We are using Zoom today for our webinar, and so everyone is currently muted. But if you have questions, or if things come up, or if you're having technical difficulties anytime throughout the webinar, use the chat function. Lisa Edens is with me today, also from CAEE, and she's going to help navigate and help support any technical difficulties that come up, and try and respond to questions, etc. throughout. Since we're a small group, I may unmute you to ask questions at a couple points throughout, but we'll leave it off for now to make sure everybody gets a clear signal coming through. And then before we jump in and get started, I did want to let you know that our next month's webinar on June 28th is going to be with Great Outdoors Colorado and Sukkel Advertising are going to talk a little bit about their statewide campaign, Generation Wild, all aimed at getting kids outdoors, and how environmental education organizations can help and support that effort and jump on board. So we'd love to have you join us for that, June 28th at 3 p.m. All right, jumping into the Guidelines for Excellence. I am going to go ahead and stop my video at this point in the webinar just to make sure you have a clear signal coming across, and that the transitions don't lag. But I'm here if we need to turn it back on. Great. So the Guidelines for Excellence have been a project since the early 90s of the North American Association for Environmental Education. I am a member of the National Guidelines for Excellence Trainers Bureau, so hopefully I can answer any questions you have about any of the different Guidelines for Excellence. But the guidelines were really started as a way to set standards for our field, a way to combat some of the negative feedback that we got about being fluffy in environmental education and not having some of those clear goals and guidelines. And so the North American Association for Environmental Education took that on, and took on that task of creating what are the best practices in the field that we can use and really make sure that we're providing excellent environmental education in whatever setting we are in. There are 6 different sets of guidelines. We're going to be focusing on the K through 12 learner guidelines today, but there are also materials guidelines. So how to put together great EE materials. What should you be thinking about, whether that's a lesson plan, a curriculum, a book, you name it. There are guidelines for preparation and professional development of environmental educators. And that's all about what should we know and be able to do if we're going to be educating about the environment. What are the skills and best practices for us? There is a set of non-formal program guidelines that really walks through how to put together and design a great non-formal program, and what are all the things that we should be thinking about. There's also a set of guidelines for early childhood learners, really bringing together the best of early childhood best practices and environmental education together. And then the newest set of guidelines is a set of guidelines on community engagement. So definitely check those out. There's a ton of resources available. So just to get an idea as we get started about what your experience with the guidelines is, I'm popping up a poll here. So go ahead and select all the ones that you have used in your work. And no worries if you haven't used any of them. Sometimes they are a best kept secret. Give you 30 more seconds and then I'll close it. All right, it looks like there are a couple of us who have used the materials guidelines and the K-12 learner guidelines. So great to know that some of you have experience with the ones that we'll be talking about today, which is awesome. If you haven't checked them out, they're a great resource. They're all available for free online. You can find them on CAE's website or on NAAE's website. All right. Currently, the work that's being done on the guidelines is sponsored as part of EE 360, which is a cooperative agreement between NAAEE and the US EPA Office of Environmental Education. So as a result of that work and that grant, we are able to revise the guidelines periodically. And right now, we are revising the K-12 learner guidelines, which is why this is a timely topic, and we're hoping to get your feedback to know a little bit more about if we're in the right place and if those guidelines are resonating with you. Just to give you a little bit of background on how the guidelines came together, all of the guidelines have been developed through a public participatory process. And so NAAEE has engaged educators in deep discussion around what quality environmental education practice looks like. Over 2,000 educators in each of the creation of the guides participated in contributing and editing and making sure that this really is what the field thinks in terms of what best practices are. All of the guidelines are designed with these 6, what we call essential underpinnings of environmental education. So you'll see these themes throughout each of the sets of guidelines, and those are really using systems thinking and thinking in systems, interdependence between the human and the natural environment, being place-based and really thinking about the importance of where one lives, integration and infusion, and this is really about how do we integrate into multiple disciplines, how do we infuse environmental education into different settings, how do these apply no matter where we are and what we're doing. These are all rooted in the real world. You'll notice each of the guidelines has series of examples, and we'll have what does this look like when it's being used, and they all focus on lifelong learning. So you'll see those themes throughout. So why are we updating now? Why is this a critical time period? A lot has happened since the last revision, which was in 2004. We've had several new national standards come out, including the Next Generation Science Standards, the Common Core standards, the C3 framework for social studies standards. And then we've also had specific guidelines for climate literacy, energy literacy, and ocean literacy. And so there's a real need to just take a look and make sure that they're cross-referenced and that you can look back and forth between the guidelines, as well as just updating context for how environmental education has changed over the years. So it's a good time to be looking at how to update these standards. So the K-12 learner guidelines, when we think about what these are and why we need them, they essentially are giving us the goals for what we're working towards, the goals for environmental literacy. This is a quote that I pulled from the Next Generation Science Standards, but I think applies the same to our work, in that we can't successfully prepare students to be environmentally literate unless we know where we're headed. And that's what putting together these standards are all about. And so when you look at what are standards, educational standards are the learning goals for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. And we are generally mostly focused on, when you think about standards for learners, we have the Common Core standards that you'll hear about a lot, the Next Generation Science Standards, which are national standards. And then the Guidelines for Excellence are really our environmental education national standards that we can use to help influence things like the Colorado Academic Standards. So the Colorado Academic Standards are always going to probably be what you use the most frequently and what you go back to, because it's what your audiences and teachers are using. However, every time they do a revision, we look at the Guidelines for Excellence and see what's missing and where we can comment and how we can incorporate more of the Guidelines for Excellence into our current academic standards. So you will see a lot of overlap and a lot of these things integrated into the academic standards. And we've been really successful at doing that and making sure that that is in those standards. So the goals of the K-12 learner guidelines, they set those expectations not at every grade level, but at grades 4th, 8th, and 12th. They provide a framework for effective EE programs and curricula. They demonstrate how EE can be used to meet some of those other national and state standards. And they define the goals for EE. So as a field, this is a really important set of guidelines. So the guidelines define an environmentally literate person, which is our ultimate goal, as someone who both individually and together with others makes informed decisions concerning the environment, is willing to act on those decisions to improve the well-being of other individuals, societies, and the global environment, and participates in civic life. So what are all the pieces that come together that an individual needs to know and be able to do to get to this place? That's what the guidelines outline. How the guidelines are organized, they are basically broken down into 4 different strands. There are 4 big buckets that we want students to know and be able to do in order to be environmentally literate. The first is questioning, analysis, and interpretation skills. The second, I think, is most of the time what we think of when we think of standards is the content piece, that knowledge of environmental processes and systems. The third is really skill-based, skills for analyzing and investigating environmental issues. And the fourth bucket is personal and civic responsibility. And so knowing that we haven't dove too deep into any of these yet, I want you to think for just a second about your programs and what's the easiest and what's the most challenging out of those strands to accomplish. I just launched another poll. So you can answer that question. What strand is the most challenging to incorporate into your programs? And that can be because of time. It could be because of what your mission is. There could be all kinds of factors that play into this. So there's no right or wrong answer here, just to get an idea of what your thoughts are.
And Katie, sorry to interrupt, but we had a couple people that weren't able to actually answer the poll for one reason or another. So would it be okay if maybe they just put their answers into the chat?
Sure, absolutely. All right, for those of you who were able to enter your results, it looks like personal and civic responsibility, the action piece of what we do, tends to be the most difficult. And that, I think, is true across the board. Anytime I've done a workshop on this, that is one of the ones that comes up as one of the most challenging to really build that piece in. So you are not alone. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into these 4 strands, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are changing as we're moving forward. So questioning, analysis, and interpretation skills. Oh, I apologize. Before we dig into that, let me just show you what the guidelines look like in their current form. You can see the strand is at the top. And then they're generally broken down into a couple of sub-strands. You can see here, knowledge of environmental processes and systems. We've got the Earth as a physical system. The next one is the Earth as a living system. So breaking it into a little smaller buckets. And then you have guidelines. And those are subsets within that strand. And then the bullets that you see are examples. That list is definitely not comprehensive, but it just gives you a few ideas of what it might look like if a learner knows and is able to do whatever that skill or content area is. Off to the left, you will see they reference other standards, national standards, and where the overlaps are. So you can see some overlaps with science and some overlaps with geography. So in the next version, those will refer back to the next generation science standards and the C3 framework and Common Core, etc. Questioning, analysis, and interpretation skills. This is broken into a couple buckets that should look pretty familiar if you've dug into any of the national science standards or the Colorado academic standards. You're going to see a lot of these bullets in other places with slightly different language, but a lot of overlaps. These are all skills that help us investigate, help us question, help us look at information, things that help us understand the content that we get to in strand 2. So here you can see a little bit of a cross-reference with the next generation science standards and the NGSS science and engineering practices, which is part of the overall framework. So every standard within NGSS contains a science and engineering practice. And for the most part, you will see they match up really well with the guidelines for excellence in environmental education. Mathematics and computational thinking, we don't see a lot of in the guidelines for excellence. And I know that's something that the steering committee who is looking at this is really looking at closely to see whether that should be in there or not, and what that looks like in the revision. And they're using the next generation science standards and the other national standards to look at some of those pieces. If you're familiar with the Colorado academic standards, you'll see those skills in a couple of different places. This standard, which is from middle school life science, this is the new draft. So these haven't even been officially approved yet. So the format is changing a little bit, but you'll see strand 1 really strongly, not necessarily in the actual grade level expectation, the standard, but you'll see it down below in a couple buckets. You'll see it in the Colorado Essential Skills and Science and Engineering Practices, and in some of the cross-cutting concepts. There's connections to the nature of science where you'll see that overlap pretty significantly. Strand 2 is knowledge of environmental processes and systems. And what I love about strand 2 is that they divide it into 4 substrands, and 2 of those have to do with the natural environment, and 2 of those really have to do with the human environment, and the intersection between those 2 things. And that those are really treated as equal parts. And sometimes I think it's really easy to focus just on the natural environment or just on the human environment, but this brings them together really, really nicely. And we have substrands for the Earth as a physical system, the Earth as the living environment, more life science, humans and their societies, and this gets broken down into economic systems, political systems, technology, and those types of things. And then environment and society is really around how do we make decisions as individuals and groups, and how do societies operate. And so all of those pieces are included within strand 2. So strand 2, as you can imagine, is a pretty big bucket. In the same way that they looked at some of those skills in the next generation science standards, the committee that is revising this and looking at this is also looking at how does the content shape out. So you can see the strands across the top and the different content areas within the next generation science standards down the left-hand side, and really looking for what's the overlap and how do we find all of these pieces within what we want students to know and be able to do. And if it's not there, should it be? So this was a great way to really look at those standards and what's there. Strand 3 is skills for understanding and addressing environmental issues. Now, this is one where I would caution folks to definitely think about how you use this one. I think sometimes when we think about environmental issues, we think about really controversial things like reintroducing wolves or climate change or some of these bigger issues, but you can also explore this on a really small scale. And what you look at with learners could be more like an environmental decision. And you might not frame it in your head as an issue, but these same skills apply to that. So there's probably lots of ways we're applying these skills and don't even necessarily realizing that we're helping students reach those skills. I also think there's a tendency within the field for folks to think that issue investigation happens at later grades, which when you look at these standards, you will see that skills for understanding and addressing environmental issues happen at all grades, at all age periods. It's just what you look at and how you look at those issues that changes. An example of an issue you might investigate in kindergarten might be something like, do I step on the bug on the playground or not? You would go through the same steps to think about, what are the impacts of stepping on the bug? Who else cares about the bug? What do they think about it? Would they want me to or not want me to? And making decisions and going through some of those skills in the same way that you might address climate change with adults. Just a very different scale. So definitely one of the things that is really great about the guidelines is it breaks down and looks at, what does that look like at 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, and how does that continue to advance over time? So the first substrand is really those skills for analyzing and investigating environmental issues. And the second is decision-making and citizenship skills. Not only is I think this one is really critical, I always like to mention that in the National Environmental Literacy Assessment, which is about 5 years ago now, they tested in the second round of the assessment, they looked at schools that had high quality environmental education programs in them and tested the environmental literacy of those students. And when they were receiving high quality environmental education, they were doing really well at environmental sensitivity. Their environmental knowledge went up. You saw a lot of gains. However, almost all the students still failed the section on understanding and addressing environmental issues. So I think we, as a field, we have some work to do to really improve how we're helping students meet these skills. Strand 4 is personal and civic responsibility. And this one is broken up into a couple different buckets. Understanding societal values and principles, recognizing rights and responsibilities, recognizing efficacy, and accepting personal responsibility. And the guidelines do a really great job of breaking those down and what that looks like at different grades to understand some of those pieces. But making sure that in environmental education, we are moving our learners at whatever age they are to have personal and civic responsibility. So before we jump into some of the revision areas, are there any questions or comments about the strands, what's generally in the guidelines? And I did go ahead and unmute you so you can ask a question out loud. All right, no questions so far. Feel free to type those into the chat and I will watch for those if they come up. But we'll talk a little bit about the revision that's coming up here. So some of the goals that NAAEE has with revising the guidelines are to fix some of the just small language pieces, really fit with and support U.S. national standards. And those include the C3, which is the social studies framework, science standards, the next generation science standards, the global competency, and the Common Core. Really hoping to support some other national and international curriculum frameworks and looking at that and making sure that they align and there's not anything missing. Also looking at those climate, ocean, and energy literacy and the alignments there. And then really working to enhance the social justice, environmental justice, equity, and sustainability pieces. If you have looked at any of the revised editions, one of the things you'll notice that a lot of the revisions are really happening in the 12th grade, a lot of the big changes, whereas some of the lower grades are staying similar. But for example, in strand 2, in the human environment and societies, previously there was a guideline about political and economic systems, and really they felt strongly that those needed to be separated and be their own guidelines within the guidelines. So you'll see some of that language becoming more intentional. A couple of the other changes you see in the 12th grade, some of the language is becoming more intentional in strand 3 around how you identify and critique different solutions. There are language changes in evaluating the results of action. And then in addition to recognizing efficacy, they added a guideline around developing agency for learners in the 12th grade. So those are some of the bigger changes you'll see among the guidelines. Most of the changes have really been in those example areas, in those bullets that we looked at in terms of how they're set up. Lots of new ways to explain that, technology to incorporate in, that type of thing. So you'll see a lot of changes there. So how to review. The form and the guidelines are located on NAAEE's website, and we will send you a follow-up email with both the review form and this link so that you can take a look at the new guidelines. In this round of review, there is a deadline of June 1st, so there's about 2 weeks to provide comments yet on some of those changes, as well as just really thinking about how in your work, is your work represented in them? Is there anything really important that's missing? These are community driven, and so your input and expertise is really important to making sure that we have everything we need included within the draft. Or if there's something that's not as relevant, that we get rid of those things and make sure they're up to date for what's happening. So definitely encourage you and invite you to check that out. And again, we will send that to you so that it's easy to find. A couple other resources I wanted to share with you about the National Guidelines for Excellence. Depending on where you work and how you use the guidelines, there are quite a few tools up on NAAEE's website that will help you match what you're doing in your work to some of these national standards. So they've already done alignments between the NAAEE guidelines and all of the national standards, and you can find those, find what you're looking for, and see how it relates back to environmental education, or vice versa, see how the environmental education piece correlates within the standards to make that really easy for you to find and use and pull out for your work. The same thing exists, correlation tools for the ocean literacy, climate literacy, and energy literacy principles. And you can find those and find the overlaps and those correlations really easy. We'll send out this PowerPoint as well, so you don't have to write down that super long URL, but those resources are available. This is an example of what it looks like, where you have the guideline on the left and the principles from climate, ocean, or energy literacy in the columns on the right. So you can see where those match up. In terms of Colorado resources, if you haven't checked it out, within the Colorado Environmental Education Plan, we have identified all of the standards that relate to environmental education, and the content specialists at the Colorado Department of Education actually worked to pull those out and identify within science, social studies, physical education, health, and reading, writing, communicating, and math, I believe, all the standards that relate. And so instead of going to the 125-page science document, you can go to this brief document and pull out what you need really quickly. It's an easy correlation tool that you can use as you're looking to line up your lessons and programs to academic standards. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. So short and sweet today. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions about the revision, about the guidelines, about how you can use them. Would love to hear more about how you're using the guidelines in your work. But that gives you a quick overview so that you're able to dig in and give comments. So I will unmute the group again, so that if you have any comments or questions to share, you can. And while you're thinking and typing, again, I want to invite you to attend our webinar next month about how to get involved in GOCO's Generation Wild campaign. We'd love to have as many environmental educators as possible helping spread that word so we get the biggest impact as possible out of that great campaign to get kids outdoors. And again, that's on June 28th. If there aren't any questions, we'll wrap up early. Oh, looks like we had a comment right here. They are planning to update current lesson plans this summer and want to align them with the guidelines and standards you mentioned. And I'm glad you said that, because that also reminds me of one more resource that I didn't include in here. On NAAEE's website, you can actually find a self-assessment for the guidelines. And so you can take a lesson plan or a program and just go through and fill out the self-assessment. And it's a really easy way to look at and evaluate your programs and see where and how they line up. So that's a great resource you might want to check out as well. Well, great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. If in the meantime you have any questions about the guidelines that come up, feel free to email me. I'm happy to chat about specifics and how you can use them and incorporate them into your programming and really demonstrate the alignment between what an environmentally literate person is and how your programs help people get there, because we know you're all doing amazing work. So have a great afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.